Buongiorno a tutti gli ascoltatori e a tutte le ascoltatrici di Radio Quarantena. Oggi è 1° giugno del 2021, come promesso questa mattina nel caffè dell'editoriale mandiamo un contributo che ci hanno inviato i compagni di Guerriglia Radio, che loro hanno mandato in onda ormai più di 2 settimane fa, che riguarda la Palestina, un tema che abbiamo affrontato ampiamente, ma non è mai sufficiente. Ovviamente le recenti modificazioni dell'assetto politico-parlamentare israeliano, sempre rivolto all'estrema destra, ha cambiato qualcosa, ma la questione in sé rimane assolutamente di rilievo, e parlare di genocidio o di pulizia etnica in questo momento non sembra essere un qualcosa di molto lontano ai noi dalla realtà. Bene, allora vi lascio a questa conversazione con Ali Abunimahl, in inglese, in grande parte della stessa. Mi scuso in anticipo chi non dovesse comprendere la gran parte dei contenuti. Agli altri e alle altre auguro buon ascolto e a risentirci presto.
Salve a tutti, io sono Fiore di Sfondo e questa è Guerriglia Radio. Oggi vi proponiamo una conversazione che ho avuto con Ali Abunimahl ad inizio marzo. Ali è un giornalista e autore palestinese, nonché fondatore di Electronic Intifada, che è una delle più importanti pubblicazioni al mondo sulla causa della liberazione della Palestina. Ali è anche un autore. I suoi libri, come One Country and the Battle for Justice in Palestine, sono universalmente considerati come testi seminali da chiunque abbia a cuore la causa palestinese. Senza rubarvi altro tempo, ecco la nostra conversazione, in cui parliamo del ruolo dell'Unione Europea nell'oppressione dei palestinesi, delle radici identitarie alla base del supporto per Israele, di come l'entità sionista sdogani la peggiore destra europea e di altro ancora. Buon ascolto, on Free Palestine.
I come like a comet newborn, like the sun that rises at morning. I come like the furious tempest that follows the thundercloud's warning. I come like the fiery lava from cloud-covered mountains volcanic. I come like a storm from the north that the oceans awake to in panic.
Welcome to Guerriglia Radio. Today we have the pleasure to be joined by Ali Abunimahl, who is the founder and editor of the Electronic Intifada, which is one of the best resources for those interested in Palestine liberation. Ali is also an author and has written 2 seminal books, One Country in 2007 and The Battle for Justice in Palestine. It must be said that when Ali wrote One Country, it was sort of fringe position. Now is becoming more and more mainstream. It has also been accepted by some liberal Zionists. So, Ali, welcome.
Thank you very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure.
So, the battle for justice in Palestine, to quote your book, is extremely important for so many of us around the world. Perhaps because it's emblematic of so many other struggles. Maybe it's also the viciousness of the occupation and the fact that it seems that all the main supporters of Zionism are also among the enforcers of the unequal dominant power structure. So, considering that polls show that the support for Israel is dwindling and that the one for Palestine liberation is growing, how far do you think the liberation is?
Well, let me just say that you asked a very good question, or you suggested a good question of why Palestine seems to be central to so much of world politics today. Of course, Palestine is a place, and it has a people who are suffering and struggling, and so that's one aspect. But Palestine is quite a small country on the global stage, so we have to ask why it's so important. And I think that it's worth underlining, as you said, that we see anywhere in the world, you can look at where support for Israel is and where support for Palestinians are, and it will give you a very quick way to tell the power structure, really. And this is very true, by the way, in Europe, where we see strong grassroots and popular support for Palestinian rights, and on the other hand, very strong support for Israel among the elites. So among the media elites, among the political elites across Europe and in the European Union. And Palestine is also a very good test for whether somebody's left-wing politics are actually left-wing or not. There's this phrase, progressive except for Palestine, meaning that you have many so-called leftists or center-leftists who are left on so many issues, but then when it comes to Palestine, they're either silent or they, or they take a pro-Israel position. And the other thing is that Palestine has become really a laboratory for oppression that is then exported to the whole world. Palestinians are the testing subjects for weaponry, for espionage and surveillance, and all of this then Israel exports to the rest of the world, boasting that, oh, this is field tested and battle tested. And this is very true in the European Union, where there is a huge European Union investment in so-called Israeli research and innovation, which is actually, weapons and military and surveillance research that is then marketed across Europe. And we see this now with Frontex, the European Union, border agency that is trying to stop refugees from reaching the shores of Europe, which has now done a deal to buy Israeli drones to patrol the Mediterranean. And these are the same drones that were developed and tested by killing Palestinians in Gaza and other places. So that gives you a picture of I think, a very quick sketch of why the question of Palestine still has such a large place. Palestine is the last major anti-colonial struggle of the 20th century that is as yet unresolved. It's the last major anti-colonial battle of the 20th century that has still not resulted in any kind of liberation.
Yes, indeed. In fact, you also anticipated a few questions that I wanted to ask you later, such as the fact that Israel tests weapons on Palestinian and then in arms fairs sells them, saying it's battle tested. Robert Fisk wrote extensively about that a few years ago.
In addition, you also mentioned the EU, which is often portrayed as this benevolent entity that is not as imperialistic or belligerent as the US. But in fact, while the EU may have some small project in support for Palestinians, such as financing small schools and so on the other hand, structurally supports and finances Israel and the occupation, with things like allowing Israeli institutions to apply for EU grants, even though Israel is not a member state. I would appreciate if you could explain a bit the role that the EU plays in the occupation and the oppression of Palestinians.
Yes, I mean, you're right about sort of the branding or marketing of the EU as kind of a kinder, gentler, softer power that is based on values. And for many years, I believed this myself. I lived during my childhood and teenage years in Europe and was educated there. So I was indoctrinated with this kind of European vision, which I thought at the time was a very good vision because, the original idea of the EU was to never again to have war in the European continent, and to let's say learn the lessons of the two world wars.
May I interject in this? Because I have a lot of discussions with my Italian comrades general about the EU, because a lot of people kind of misinterpret the EU such as an internationalist project. In fact, it's not an internationalist project. It's a wider nationalist project.
Yes, well, I let me get to that, because I'm telling you what the propaganda was and what I believed. I'm not saying what I think the reality is. And to be honest, there were aspects of the EU that were very, very admirable. The ones probably that people identify most easily with, for example, the free movement of people and so on. But if there was any kind of reality to that, let's say for the sake of argument, the EU was for some years in the beginning on the right track. You might disagree with that. That's okay. But let's say it was on the right track for some period of time. It is definitely now, and for many years has been, on a very wrong track towards what you say, a wider nationalism, replacing the individual nationalisms of Italy and Germany and France with a European nationalism, which, in my opinion, is based in Christian supremacy and white supremacy. Now, that is not explicit, but I think that's very much there. And you see that played out both at the national level within the European Union and at the sort of European level. Let me give you an example. In the 1980s, when I was living in Belgium, and I was a teenager, at that time in Brussels, in Belgium, in France, in the Netherlands, who were the workers who were coming to rebuild Europe after the World War, after the Second World War? They were Moroccans, Turks, Algerians, and by the way, a lot of people from Southern Europe, Italians, Portuguese, Spanish, were all coming to the richer northern countries. Now, we didn't have, because of course you had the Cold War, we didn't have a large number of Polish people, we didn't have a large number of people from the Czech Republic and so on. The people who came to rebuild Europe, to do the work, to do the low-paid work, to suffer the racism, were people from North Africa and people from Southern Europe. I remember in the 1980s, there was a period where there was this idea that Morocco could join the European Union, Algeria could join the European Union. Of course, it was called the European Community at that time. Turkey could join. But none of those countries were ever actually seriously considered, even though Morocco is 9 miles away or 9 kilometers away from Europe, from Spain. And those are the people who are actually organically, materially there building Europe, literally building Europe. Instead, they were categorically excluded. Why? Because they don't fit the conception of who a European is. Whereas the project was actually then to expand to the east, to the countries that had no role in the reconstruction of Western Europe after World War II, to integrate them into Western Europe as part of an expansionist project, along with expanding NATO, and as part of a chauvinist project, where, Morocco, which is 9 kilometers from Spain, can't be considered part of Europe, but today Ukraine, which is I don't know how many miles from Brussels, is a natural part of Europe. So when you start to interrogate those assumptions, you start to see actually the racist and chauvinist conception that is behind the European idea today. And then you add on top of that the fact that it is not a Europe. The European Union is not a Europe of citizens and workers. It is an EU of corporations and lobbyists. And you add also, and of course, banks and financiers and so on. And you also add to this the corruption, the lack of democracy, the lack of accountability. So what I'm coming up to say is that it's natural when you take the big picture of Europe to find that the EU is among the most reactionary forces on the global stage. and is not in any way softer than the United States when it comes to these things. You look at any international issue or issue of solidarity, the EU is on the wrong side of it. So they support the American-backed efforts to overthrow the government of Venezuela. They supported the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which brought Nazis to power in Ukraine, which brought the so-called Azov Battalion, literal Nazis, into the power structure in Ukraine. You look at, of course, Palestine, and you see that naturally the European Union is fully supportive of Israel. They have a very deep trade with Israel that is an economic, commercial trade and a military trade. And as far as their political positions go, the EU is sometimes very, very gently critical of Israel. But the bottom line is they support Israel 100%. Now, the other thing I want to say, since your listeners, since the listeners in this podcast are in Italy, one of the things that disappoints me today about Europe is that the main critique of the EU is coming from the right. And, it's coming from the Brexit crowd and from, Viktor Orban and other right-wing people in Poland and in Hungary. Then where really the main critique of the European Union, the main political force behind the critique of the European Union should actually be coming from the left. But when I look, at least from my perspective in Chicago, other than perhaps some fairly marginal voices here and there, the left and the center left in Europe is either resigned to the European Union or actually embraces it. And there should be a strong left critique of the European Union, both in terms of the EU's effect on Europe and Europeans and its malevolent role in the world.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. But I must say that sadly, this institutional left in the EU has been, let's say, Americanized. Has followed, let's say, a few years too late, the so-called Clinton policy. Let's say is not left anymore. I was thinking about the Partito Democratico here in Italy, or besides the Corbyn parenthesis Labour in the UK. They are more liberal institutions. First of all, I firmly believe that liberals aren't leftist. Liberalism is a right-wing ideology, and it has always been so. It can be considered progressive only if compared to absolute monarchy during the French Revolution. But besides that, it has always been more for not individual rights, but individualistic rights. And in the right, liberals include also the right for profit. And profit in a capitalist environment is made by oppression and exploitation. So just for stylize the concept, is like liberals, in my opinion, are more right-wingers who cosplay as leftists rather than actual leftists. They say the words that may trigger some Pavlovian response or idea of affinity in a left-winger. But in fact, there are no structural policies that are left policies. They are, at best, they ameliorate the excesses of capitalism, but they are part of the power structure immune system. They can curb the excesses so that capitalism and the system of oppression can proceed and grow even stronger.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that at all. And, I don't know how much detail you want to get in as far as the EU is concerned.
No, perhaps, well, I would like to talk to you for days, but I know that you're busy, so...
Yeah, but one thing I want to add on that is that in terms of the practical policies that people should know about, is that the EU is making huge investments in Israel. under the guise of scientific research, the so-called Horizon 2020 program, and now the new version called Horizon Europe, which is investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of euros in so-called research in Israel, much of it going to companies and universities that are deeply involved and deeply complicit in Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. The other thing is the huge volume of trade between the EU and Europe, and this includes, by the way, trade in goods from Israeli settlements, which are, free to enter the European market without any problems. And in fact, although the EU has on paper a policy that goods from Israeli settlements should be labeled as such, they have admitted in documents which we managed to get under freedom of information requests that the EU, in fact, has no way of enforcing this. So the Israelis can put whatever label they like on the goods they export, and the EU really has no way of checking whether these goods really have an origin in a settlement in the West Bank or in the Golan Heights, for example, or some other part of Israel. And then we already mentioned the weapons trade, which is marketed as battle-tested, and a number of countries in the EU are buying and selling weapons with Israel. And we have, of course, the EU's opposition to any form of resistance, So we have this situation where, Europeans, West Europeans, are very jealous of their history of resistance to the Nazis. And they say, we fought and we resisted and we had the underground and we were heroes, but nobody else is allowed to resist. Palestinians are not allowed to resist. Even an army occupying their towns and villages, they're called terrorists if they resist. Okay, so let's say no armed resistance. How about peaceful resistance? How about boycott, divestment, and sanctions? Well, sorry, you can't do that either. The EU is also against that. So in other words, what the European Union wants from Palestinians is surrender. And that's their role, is to play, we have this saying in American, good cop, bad cop. Do you have an equivalent in Italy?
Yes, poliziotto buono, poliziotto cattivo.
Exactly. And so the EU plays the good cop against the American bad cop, but they're all on the same side.
But they're all cops.
That's in a summary. That's it in a nutshell.
Yes. Also, concerning the, let's say, formal ban on the goods produced in the occupied territories.
No, there's no ban. No, that we have to be very clear about that. There's no ban. The EU is very clear. We welcome, in fact, the ambassador of the EU in Tel Aviv, the previous one, actually wrote an op-ed. He said, goods from settlements are welcome in European markets, but they have to be labeled as coming from settlements. So there's no ban. The only country that attempted to to pass a law banning the importation of goods from settlements was Ireland. And unfortunately, the Irish political establishment, which of course is totally part of the EU elite, and they completely buy into the EU elite. They're all from the same mindset.
Yeah.
They opposed it, and the EU has opposed it. And so even though the law passed in the Irish Parliament, in both houses of the Irish Parliament, the government is blocking the final passage there, which I think is a perfectly good demonstration that actually the EU represents the theft of sovereignty and the theft of democracy from peoples in Europe, because people
Absolutely.
in Italy, in Ireland, in any country have no right really to make laws by themselves, because the laws are imposed from Brussels and decided in advance, and you really don't have any say. So they're saying now that no country in the EU can make a law that contradicts European law, but European law is made totally behind closed doors. So that's a really good example that when the Irish people, through their elected representatives, attempted to exercise their independence and sovereignty by saying we do not want to allow goods from occupied territories, from settlements, into the Irish market. They were blocked at the European level.
Absolutely. Now, what I wanted to say is actually that even though, let's say, imagine that there would be a ban on goods from the settlements. In my opinion, that would be a hypocrisy because the settlements aren't standalone entities. They're financed, built by the state. So in order to have sanctions to be effective, there should be sanctions on all Israeli goods, not only those from the settlements, because otherwise, it's extremely marginal, simply cosmetic. No. Even a cosmetic thing would be too much for the EU, apparently.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. All Israeli goods should be boycotted, no question about that, just like all South African goods were boycotted in the time of the anti-apartheid struggle. I'm old enough to remember that.
Yes,
but my point regarding the EU is even on something like the settlements, where the EU says we consider the settlements to be a major violation of international law, built on land stolen from Palestinians. So according to the EU, right, even that they cannot translate into the minimal action of banning goods from settlements. The point about the EU that's important, because maybe many listeners don't know it, but relations between Israel and the European Union are governed by the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which was signed, I believe, in the year 2000. That's the framework. And in a way, this framework gives Israel so many privileges and advantages, almost like it's a member of the European Union.
Even more, because it doesn't contribute to the budget.
Correct. And yet, Article 2 of this agreement, so we're talking about the top level, Article 2 of the agreement states that this agreement has as a fundamental and central value and depends on respect for human rights. So based on the agreement itself, that agreement should be suspended, because the agreement itself says that, this whole agreement depends on respect for human rights. And not even the European Union believes that Israel respects human rights. According to EU states, according to individual states, according to European officials, Israel violates human rights all the time. It breaks international law all the time. So European citizens have the right to say, we don't want anything from you except to implement the agreement that you signed with Israel, which says that it should depend on human rights, and therefore this agreement needs to be suspended. This should be an important point of pressure from the Italian public, from the European public, that we demand that Article 2 of the Association Agreement is enforced.
Absolutely. But usually, let's say, Israel gets away with simply a slap on the wrist, and then it can continue its colonialist project. In fact, do you think that so much of the support for Israel comes from a sort of nostalgic for the era of colonization that now can't be celebrated anymore? Or in the case of the US, which is frankly is the Israel's main sponsor, could the support of Israel be an indirect celebration of the colonialist past, on the myth of the frontier, where the white man goes somewhere and colonizes the savages who aren't white?
That's a great question, and I think there are different aspects to it. But what I would say is very apparent is that the settler colonial regimes in the world, particularly the Anglo-Saxon settler colonial regimes, are the ones that seem to identify most strongly with Israel politically and culturally. So to give you a very relevant example, the only countries that, as you know, just a few days ago as we're speaking, the International Criminal Court gave
Yes.
gave a ruling basically allowing the prosecutor to proceed with war crimes investigations against Israeli leaders. That's the ultimate meaning of the ruling, that to give a green light for those investigations. Who are the countries that fiercely criticized this decision? The United States, no surprise, Australia, and Canada. So the three big settler colonial states.
I must say that here in Italy, all the neo-fascisti, such as Salvini, I don't know if you're aware of the Italian
of course.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Many people from the far right have talked about the indecency of, how could it be possible that a moral entity, which is part of the Israeli propaganda, can be involved with the ICC? Because apparently, only black leaders or leaders from Slavic countries can be persecuted by the ICC.
Correct, exactly. Yeah, and so of course you will find right-wing leaders and parties all over Europe who will condemn this too. But at the government level, so far anyway, it's been Canada, the United States, and Australia, the settler colonial countries. So there is a strong identification with Israel. Also, as you pointed out, on the European far right, people like Salvini, also in other right-wing parties in Germany and France and Hungary and Poland and so on, who see Israel as the ideal in the sense of, for them it's not so much settler colonization that's the ideal, but it is the idea of an ethno-state for one ethnic group, which is what many in Europe would like to emulate. And they believe and embrace Israel's marketing as the outpost of civilization among the barbarians, meaning, of course, the Muslims in the current view of Europeans.
Just a second, because there's something that I always found very interesting. The leaders that you mentioned, they all had the blessing of acceptability. It's something that happens when a right-wing leader emerges. They always go to visit Israel to have a sort of patent of acceptability. And then they come home. So, okay, I'm not Nazi anymore, because stupidly people identify Nazism with the specificity of anti-Semitism rather than supremacy and the whole system, the whole structure. Sorry, I just wanted to say that.
Well, no, it's a very important point. It works at multiple levels, because there is, for some of these right-wing parties, a genuine admiration for Israel as an ethno-state that they want to emulate. I'll give you the example of Richard Spencer, who is a white supremacist neo-Nazi in the United States. And he was one of the supporters of Donald Trump. And his agenda is very clear. He wants to form what he calls a European ethno-state in North America. In other words, a territorial division where part of North America will be exclusively a whites-only state, and then, the others will either be expelled or they will be relegated to a different part of the territory. So a real Nazi vision. Richard Spencer says very clearly, he says, Israel is the model. He says, Israel is the model. So, it's a blueprint. So that's, at one level, it's a genuine identification and admiration. But mind you, it's important to note that admiration and identification with Israel is not incompatible with anti-Semitism. In fact, it's very compatible, because as far as someone like Richard Spencer is concerned, the best thing is to have a separate state for Jews so they don't have to be in the European Christian ethno-state. So the basis for a lot of support, European, American support for Zionism, is anti-Semitism. And this was the original impetus for Zionism. Remember that the origins of Zionism wasn't a Jewish movement. It was Zionism, for most of its history, was actually rejected by the vast majority of European Jews. The first Zionists were Protestant Christians who saw Zionism as a way of getting Jews out of what they saw as Christian Europe. And then, of course, Winston Churchill, who was a big anti-Semite, was also an anti-Semite and, of course, a major colonialist and imperialist, that goes without saying, was a big supporter of Zionism because he saw Zionism as being the way to turn Jews against communism. Because remember that communism was seen as being a movement that attracts Jews, unites Jews with other workers, and so on and so forth. So he saw Zionism as a counterweight to communism. And so that also provides a clue as to why, until today, Israel is always an ally of the imperialist countries, whether it was Britain before or the United States and the European Union today.
Perfect. No, actually, also Balfour was an anti-Semite.
Correct.
And
yeah.
In fact, I have the idea that in reality, Zionism is an anti-Semitic ideology because it implied that Jews had no place in Europe, that Jews couldn't integrate in Europe, therefore they had to go and colonize somewhere else. And in my opinion, this is an anti-Semitic idea.
Absolutely, and there have been many, good scholarly works written about that in recent years. Someone who has also done very good recent work on this is Joseph Mashad, professor at Columbia University, who has a number of articles, many of which I think have been translated into Italian, on the relationship between anti-Semitism and Zionism historically and today. So that is something that I think people need to know. And today, of course, I think the major support for Zionism in the European Union is coming from some of the most reactionary and anti-Semitic quarters. And that's true both within EU member states and at the European national level. When you look at how some of the most pro-Israel governments, like Hungary, are also the most anti-Semitic. So, Hungary is one of the countries that actually petitioned the International Criminal Court, intervened in the International Criminal Court on Israel's side to say there should be no jurisdiction to allow an investigation into Israeli war crimes. Of course, we know Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, is among the most anti-Semitic European leaders. So there's no contradiction between being a strong supporter of Israel and being an anti-Semite. And that's been the case since the beginning of the Zionist movement.
Yes, indeed. And also, concerning anti-Semitism, Zionists have weaponized the concept of anti-Semitism. They use it to shut down criticism towards Israel. Even they try to equate the definition with I don't remember the acronym, but with the new definition of anti-Semitism.
The IHRA definition.
Yes, I meant that. This happens on a small scale, but also it happens on a big scale. This, it has to do with the influence that Israel has in other countries. I'm talking about the fake anti-Semitism accusation against Corbyn. And your colleague, Gaza Winstanley, has done tremendous work on it that is published at Electronic Intifada. And we will link it in the description of the podcast. But if you could elaborate on this weaponizing of the accusation of anti-Semitism and what happened in the UK.
Yes. Well, the first thing to say is that this tactic of accusing anyone who criticizes Israel of being an anti-Semite is not new. It goes back many, many decades. However, in the recent times, the form it's taken is very specific. So there has been, in the last 10 years or so, a much more aggressive effort to equate any sort of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. And that is in itself anti-Semitic, because Palestinians have always insisted that we do not see Jews as our enemy. Israel does not represent Jews. We don't make an equation between Jewish people and Jewish religion on the one hand and Israel and Zionism on the other hand. We totally separate those. It is Israel that insists that it represents all Jews. It is Israel that puts the Star of David on the tanks and on the aeroplanes and on the uniforms of the soldiers who are going to kill Palestinians and steal their land and demolish their homes and so on. It's not us who put those symbols of Judaism on the Israeli weapons. We insist on separating them. We insist on that as a matter of principle, because we see Zionism as a colonial movement, as a European settler colonial movement with its roots in European anti-Semitism. We don't equate it with Jews. And many of our allies in fighting this struggle are Jewish. So we're very clear about that. It's Israel and its supporters who want to muddy the waters. So what they say on campuses in the United States at universities is that if you have an event criticizing Israel or showing Israel's human rights abuses against Palestinians, well, that will make Jewish students at the university feel uncomfortable and unsafe, as if every Jewish student automatically feels an identification with Israel. That is anti-Semitism.
Indeed, and also the support for Israel among the younger generation in the US.
It's collapsed. It's absolutely collapsed, which is why we see this reinvigorated effort. So now, in the last few years, there was this developed this so-called IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. The IHRA is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. The original definition, the person who wrote this definition is someone called Ken Stern, who worked at the time for the American Jewish Committee, which is an Israel lobby group. It's a Jewish communal organization, but it's also very pro-Israel. This definition was adopted by the US State Department. It was adopted by the European Union. And in the last few years, Israel and its lobby have been pressuring all governments to adopt it and all institutions to adopt it. And the European Union has been playing a big role in this. Now, this definition is actually very badly written. It's very complicated, and it's not clear. It's not, if you want a definition of something, it should be clear. I will give you a clear definition of anti-Semitism right now. My own definition. Anti-Semitism is hatred, prejudice, or discrimination against Jewish people just because they're Jewish. Full stop. That's it.
It's perfectly clear. But
it's perfect.
It wouldn't help, the Zionist cause.
Correct.
So
correct.
That's
correct. So
it's too clear.
That's too clear. So we have this complicated, wordy definition that has 11 examples attached of, this could be anti-Semitism, that could be anti-Semitism. Of the 11 examples, 7 of them are focused on Israel. So it's very clear what the purpose of this so-called definition is. It is to muddy the waters and to conflate criticism of Israel and its state ideology, Zionism, on the one hand, with hatred of Jews on the other hand. And that's the purpose of it. And it's interesting that Ken Stern, the original author of the definition, who is a Zionist and a supporter of Israel, has been very vocal in criticizing how this definition that he wrote is being misused to censor support for Palestinian rights. It's unbelievable. The author of the definition is against its use in the way that the European Union and the United States government and others are using it. Now, in the case of the Labour Party, in sum, Jeremy Corbyn was a lifelong left-wing activist, a lifelong campaigner against racism, He is someone who was arrested for protesting apartheid in South Africa. I mean, he was arrested in the UK. I don't know. There's this famous photo of him being...
yes, he was stopped at the march.
Right. So his record is well known, a record of solidarity with struggling people, against racism, for the poor, for working people. The man doesn't have a racist bone in his body. He had a strong record of solidarity with Palestine. When he was elected as leader of the Labour Party, it was a surprise. It was a glitch in the system. It wasn't, from the perspective of those in power, it wasn't supposed to be able to happen that someone like Jeremy Corbyn can reach the leadership of the Labour Party. It happened. And so therefore there was a panic, because if this happens in the Labour Party in the UK, which is the largest...
It would spread.
It could happen anywhere. So they had to make an example of Jeremy Corbyn and to sabotage this movement and to make sure that there could not be a successful left-wing leader in Europe who could win power and become prime minister of a major country, and that there could not be a leader who has a strong history of solidarity with Palestinians. This was clear. So the forces that combined against Jeremy Corbyn was not just the Israel lobby.
Oh, no, absolutely. I didn't mean that.
I know that, but I'm just giving the story.
No, sorry. I was afraid that I may have...
No, you didn't. But it wasn't just the Israel lobby, but the Israel lobby played an important role, because the narrative they settled on was to accuse Jeremy Corbyn of anti-Semitism. This was a very convenient narrative. It was a very easy narrative. It was one which was adopted by the BBC, by all of the mainstream newspapers in the UK.
By The Guardian.
By The Guardian, by the right wing of the Labour Party itself.
Who now made a coup. They tried 2 coups. One failed, and then... Yeah.
And then eventually they succeeded, really. So, but it is a totally false narrative. What do I mean by that? That's not to say that there has never in the history of the Labour Party been somebody with anti-Semitic views. I'm sure that has happened, because the Labour Party is a reflection of the broader society. The lie was to say that there was a particular problem of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, and that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite, and that his supporters are disproportionately anti-Semitic. None of this was true. This was fabrications. And you said you would kindly link to the work of my colleague Asa Winstanley, because his work and his investigation and his exposure of this fabrication and this fraud is really, forensic. Nobody has disputed it, because the facts are all clear. The problem is the facts don't get reflected in The Guardian or the BBC or on what most people see.
If I may,
Yes.
Their omission, their silence, is what I call fake news by omission. There's something important that is newsworthy, but it's not talked about. And the accusation of anti-Semitism was the weapon of choice by which they expelled also the true Corbyn's allies, such as Chris Williamson. And Asa Winstanley had a wonderful conversation a few days ago on Chris Williamson's podcast, explaining also the recent development of the case, also the fact that the Labour Party has hired a former Israeli spy who used to spy on Palestinians as a consultant of theirs.
As an employee in the office of the leader of the Labour Party, in the office of Keir Starmer, a former spy from what's called Unit 8200, which is a cyber warfare wing of the Israeli military, which is notorious, according to testimony of some of its own veterans, for spying on ordinary Palestinians, doing mass surveillance for the purpose of blackmail and political persecution. So they might, for example, spy on people in order to find out, if they're having an affair with someone, if they're, homosexual or whatever it might be, in order to blackmail them to collaborate with the occupation. That's what Unit 8200 does. And that's what that's where this guy who was hired by the Labour Party worked for 5 years. In other words, in Israel, the mandatory military service is 2 years. You might say, oh, well, he was doing his mandatory military service. That wouldn't excuse it, in my view. But he didn't do just 2 years. He was there for 5 years. He made a choice to work in this cyber warfare unit whose goal is to destroy the lives of Palestinians in order to facilitate a colonial occupation. And now he's working in the office of the leader of the Labour Party, and total silence from the mainstream media. In fact, we know that The Guardian was doing a story on this. We know that because a journalist for The Guardian was talking to people and asking for comments from people, and then the story was suppressed. It never appeared in The Guardian. You can imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had hired a former Russian spy to work in his office, it would have been national news on the BBC, The Guardian, The Times, CNN, the New York Times, everything.
And I'm sure that Owen Jones would have written profusely about it.
Definitely, and called for Corbyn to resign, I'm sure.
Now, I know you don't have much time left, and perhaps I'm also inviting you for another occasion if you fancy.
With pleasure.
There's so much to talk about concerning Israel and Palestine, but I would, since you live in the US, I would like to ask you about, the new climate, the fact that now we have a new emperor, and the fact that during the Trump years, so much of the so-called left, in the form in which the left exists in the US, so much of the left has really involved itself. I'm thinking outlets such as Democracy Now! That I used to watch every day, really up to the first days of the Trump election and from 2001. And it has become a dreadful thing. And really, anti-Trumpism has, instead of helping the left and the opposition, has been a sort of an agent of the immune system of the Democratic Party, which is a right-wing party, let's face it, it's obvious, focalized attention on the mannerism. It has felt its audience a sort of this bulimic dissent consumerism. It was a show, the opposition to Trump.
I agree with that totally. It was not politics, it was a simulacrum of politics.
Indeed. Also, from my side, from Europe and from a Marxist perspective, I don't see difference besides marginal things, but I don't see difference between Trump policies and the previous policies of the US empire. And also, let's say that Trump is obscene. Trump is obscene in the Latin sense of the word. I don't know if you're familiar, but obscene comes from obscenum. So it's behind the scene. It's obscene because it put on the front stage all the atrocities that usually are discussed on the backstage.
I agree with that completely. And in fact, Trump was, of course, a racist, a white supremacist.
But so was Obama.
Yes. Trump served only the rich and the billionaires and his cronies. But so did Obama. So did Bill Clinton. So, in fact, Clintonism is what gave us Donald Trump, because, you could say that the immediate roots of Donald Trump was in the financial crisis of 2008. The fact that millions of people lost their homes, millions of people became unemployed. The accelerated deindustrialization in many parts of the United States. This is all directly the result of Bill Clinton, particularly his policies of totally deregulating the banks and financial markets. So taking away all of the regulations that were put in place during the 1930s, the New Deal, following the Great Depression and the stock market crash of 1929, and the free trade deals that sent jobs to Mexico and then later to China, and also created huge destabilization within Mexico and generated mass migration to the north. There's been a lot of good scholarship about that, how NAFTA, it did send jobs to Mexico, but it also completely destabilized Mexican markets and economies, and that drove further immigration to the United States. So this was all unleashed by Clintonism, by the so-called New Democrats, which you have the same phenomenon in Europe with New Labour and the so-called center-left parties in continental Europe. The same kind of politics, of neoliberalism, of deregulation, of financialization, and so on. So they gave us Donald Trump. Trump is a symptom of the Democratic Party, in my view. Now, what the thing I want to say about the so-called new era, well, actually, you see that on matters of substance, there is no disagreement with Trump. So on Venezuela, the Biden administration is still supporting Juan Guaido, the fake president of fake self-declared president of Venezuela.
On this, just a second. On this, we already had a conversation with Ben Norton, but I recommend everyone to check the Gray Zone because they've been doing wonderful work on Venezuela, Bolivia, and now on Ecuador.
I agree fully. Biden, I believe he just announced, his attorney general just announced, or the Justice Department just announced that they are continuing with the Trump administration's effort to extradite Julian Assange from the United Kingdom. So far, Biden is maintaining his sanctions on Trump's sanctions on Iran, which are killing people because they're depriving Iranian people of medicine in the middle of the pandemic. And so on. Of course, when it comes to Palestine, there's almost no difference from Trump. Biden is keeping the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem. So far, he hasn't lifted Trump's sanctions on the International Criminal Court. The Biden administration is embracing the Trump administration's campaign against the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and so on. Yes, there will be
and
some
also the Golan Heights. It was the day before yesterday, in which the new Secretary of State,
Tony Blinken,
in an interview with the former AIPAC spokesperson, Wolf Blitzer, he said, aside legal issues, the Golan Heights must stay under the control of Israel.
Correct. So they market it a little bit differently. There will be some cosmetic changes. For example, they will restore probably so-called humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. But let's remember, humanitarian aid without a political solution, without liberation for Palestinians, is just like a Band-Aid solution. It's just treating the symptoms, and actually it's helping Israel because,
Israel, by international law, Israel should provide for the occupation. And also, if I may say, and perhaps this is a topic for another discussion, it also bribes a lot of influence among the, I'm quoting you here, among the corrupt Palestinian leadership, which actually collaborates for the repression with the Zionists.
Yeah, I mean, the immediate policy of the United States and the European Union is to maintain the existence of the Palestinian Authority, which I consider to be like a Vichy regime, whose role is to suppress Palestinians on behalf of Israel. And that's what the PA does. So all of the so-called humanitarian aid and aid to the Palestinian Authority is about maintaining the status quo in perpetuity, to keep the Palestinians just as if they're in a prison, and you give the prisoners enough food so they don't revolt. That's it. That's the policy. So that's the only differences with Biden. But when you look, and I do recommend the Gray Zone, I agree, because they get into a lot of detailed investigations about this. But when you look at the personnel who have been hired by Biden for top positions, these are all people who are deeply corrupt, involved in lobbying for some of the worst regimes, or working for the weapons companies that thrive from perpetual war and conflict. And now the big push, the last few years we had a relentless propaganda campaign about Russia with lies.
That was ridiculous.
The most ridiculous lies that Hillary Clinton lost because of Vladimir Putin's interference, which is total nonsense. Nobody ever discovered a single vote that was changed or affected because of Vladimir Putin or alleged Russian interference. A total fantasy on the same scale as the fantasy of Donald Trump that he won the election in 2020.
Absolutely.
The Democratic Party fantasy that Hillary Clinton lost because of Vladimir Putin is on the same scale and the same quality as Donald Trump's fantasies. But Trump is the one who is, treated as if he's the aberration. So that's, and now, of course, what we see is a major campaign of propaganda against China to turn people. And this is where, again, we have total continuity from Donald Trump. Trump tried to blame all of America's problems on China, and the Democrats are willing to do the same. And that didn't start under Trump. It started at least under Obama with his so-called pivot to Asia, which was a policy of confrontation and militarization of East Asia.
Yes, major power confrontation, they call it. Yeah, it's obscene. Going back to Trump, the fact is that Trump is portrayed, perhaps because of the obscene, in the sense that I said before, is portrayed as a parvenu of power. It's his mannerism that liberals and liberal institutions can't stand. It's his politics. But we've been talking for an hour, and I'm afraid that I've been sort of kidnapping you. So I don't know if you have another few minutes or if you should go.
I have just a couple of minutes. I have to go do something else, but I take your invitation to come back seriously. So hopefully we can. I know we had a long list of topics, but I think we had a good discussion even without reaching all of them. So
I don't know, absolutely. Just that a small comment, really on the fly, because there are figures that are portrayed as hopes. Once again, I consider them part of the immune system of the power structure. Figures such as AOC, who is perceived as this radical change. But I remember on her first interview, after she's been elected, she backtracked on her support for Palestinian liberation. So that was the moment where I said, okay, she's a fraud. Then I read her comments when the war criminal McCain died and so many other things that confirmed my intuition. Do you have thoughts about these new figures?
Yeah, of course, I think people, I try to distinguish between the people who support these so-called progressive figures.
No, absolutely. I'm talking about the persons, not the supporters.
Yeah. So, I don't like to minimize the authenticity of the enthusiasm and the hope that so many people have, whether it was in supporting Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or, the other so-called progressive figures. Now, and some of the things they've said and done I've agreed with and I've supported because, they did present some kind of challenge on some level. However, it's clear to me now that they have been almost completely co-opted into the establishment of the Democratic Party and are not doing what they promised to do, which was to challenge the establishment. And the clearest sign of that, there have been many, but let's say the final clear signal of that was how every single one of these so-called progressives lined up and voted to re-elect Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Nancy Pelosi, who's just as a matter of coincidence, is Italian American, so I don't know how well she's known. If she's celebrated,
she was whenever someone who's even remotely Italian, we bombarded with pro-US propaganda. So yes, now we know who she is.
Yes, and Nancy Pelosi, who is one of the most reactionary political figures, and is so out of touch and so right wing. And they all voted for her. And the tragedy was that she needed their votes in order to win. So they had incredible leverage where they could have made political demands. And the political demand that was coming from grassroots is tell Nancy Pelosi, if you want your votes to be reelected as Speaker, then she must have a vote on Medicare for all. Because believe it or not, in 2021, in the 21st century, you don't have a right to health care in the United States.
Which is dreadful in a pandemic.
Yes, they didn't do it. None of them did it. And instead, they started attacking and smearing and lying about the people who are making this demand that they use their political leverage. So what I want to say...
No, if I say, just a second... right now, Ali is referring to the Forced Vote campaign that was started by Jimmy Dore, who's an interesting figure.
A comedian. He's a comedian.
He has evolved a bit, and I have a lot of skepticism towards comedians who do politics. But, many people compared him to Grillo in Italy, but they are utterly different. Grillo started from a right-wing perspective, but it's complicated and I don't want to rant about it. So, sorry, just to put in context, and also we would link some information to that in the podcast notes.
Right. But, I mean, Jimmy Dore was always the first to say, you don't need to like me. It's not about Jimmy Dore. Ultimately, it's about, are people going to get health care? So, I mean, nobody is going to say, oh, well, I was going to vote for health care, but then I saw Jimmy Dore supporting health care, so I decided not to. That doesn't happen. All the issue about Jimmy Dore was another part of the tactic of distracting from the central issue, which was these so-called progressives, these so-called leftists in Congress had a unique, rare opportunity where they held the deciding votes over Nancy Pelosi's fate. And they could have gone to her and said, these are our demands. We want to have a vote in the House of Representatives on Medicare for all. And some people were saying, oh, well, what's the point of having a vote? Because, it would have been defeated anyway. Well, that's not how you do politics, okay? If you get a vote scheduled on that, then that's your rallying cry for a campaign to go out and tell people, call your representatives, tell them you have to vote for this, tell them we will never forgive you if you don't vote for this, we will challenge you, we will put a candidate against you. In other words, you don't just put your finger in the air and say, oh, the wind is blowing in this direction, so I guess that's it. You go out and you make the weather, you make the wind, you make a political movement, and they had the opportunity to do it, and they didn't do it. They refused to do it. And for me, this completely exposed them as politically fraudulent, and it exposed a lot of the so-called independent left-wing media that's on YouTube and other, online media as fraudulent as well. At the end of the day, they all became defenders of the Democratic Party establishment. And so that to me is a big lesson from what happened in the past few months with this so-called left. And I mean, many people are saying, and I tend to agree, that any hope of moving the Democratic Party to the left is a lost cause, because it is so corrupting, and those so-called left-wing people then just become, as you said, part of the defensive, I can't remember the phrase you used.
Immune system
of the Democratic Party. Exactly right. I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Now, we've been talking for a long time, and Ali, I would like to thank you. It's been a true honor for me and for us at Guerriglia Radio to talk to you, and we would just like to perhaps once again extend the invitation, and we could do it again another time.
I promise I would love to, and I promise we'll do it again. If you'll have me, I'll definitely come back. And I know you were kind enough to invite me some time ago, and it took a while before we could schedule it, but next time it won't take so long. I promise you that.
Many thanks. Okay, then grazie e ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.